Davengers. West Coast Davengers. Ah! Ah! Welcome back to the West Coast Davengers, or if you're just joining for the first time, hello. My name is Dave. I am a comic book expert, a comic book enthusiast, a comic book collector, a voracious reader, and a comic book seller. This is my channel. This is my show. Welcome in. You are going to stay forever and ever and ever and ever. Every Sunday, I drop a video just like the one you're watching, and every Sunday night is Sundave Sit Down. Midweek is West Coast Wednesday, my comic book auction and claim sale where you can buy some of the stuff that I talk about. I was tasked to come up with a good episode, and I don't have any material. I'm just going to talk about how I got started doing this, and if you're thinking about becoming a full-time comic seller or YouTuber, it is a lot of work. But I don't tell you to shy away. I just talk about a little bit of the origins, a little FAQ. Now, the origins of the name started when me and my good friend Dave Correa, who is an amazing artist and sculptor and creative genius, decided that we were going to take a little bit of a road trip where he lives in the Bay Area, and we were going to drive all the way up to where I lived at the time, which was Seattle, and hit as many comic book stores and antique malls as we could and see what kind of books we could find in our West Coast area. And because we're both Daves, I can't remember who came up with the name, if it was me or him, or if it was a combined effort. You got the West Coast Avengers? Well, we're Daves, the West Coast Davengers. It kind of worked without having to put much thought into it. Now, I met Dave a long time ago. I worked multiple Emerald City Comic Cons with him. We always talked about comics, but not until the pandemic era did we really start to think about like going back and picking up books that we always wanted, or finding books for cheap in ways that most people weren't thinking, and that was garage sales, flea markets, antique malls. Dave gave me the advice that like if I was going to do this full time, I had to go all in. And at that time in my life, I was working for the post office. I was delivering the mail during the pandemic, and I really was not happy with that. I'm not a big fan of working for the US government. It wasn't much of a leap for me, as most people, because I've had experience doing this for years, whether it was working in the comic industry, briefly worked at a comic store. I used to do card and comic shows when I was a kid as a dealer, and also just hang around comic stores and comic dealers and stuff like that. So it's always been in my blood. I've been doing eBay since 1999. I've been a seller of things, records, autographs, comics, cards, toys since 99, and it's always been secondary income. But I thought, this is the era where people are hopping on YouTube and kind of doing stuff for themselves. I thought this would be a great way for me to finally work with comics and be happy, and also not have to answer to anybody else. Originally, it was just the Sunday show, and it was just to talk about comics and to show off my hauls and show the flea markets that I go digging at and the stores that I go to. It blossomed into this channel that you're watching right now. A little bit of history in my comic collecting and my comic reading. I grew up on Long Island. In the late 1980s, early 90s in Long Island, there was, on average, 1.5 comic stores in every town. I know, 1.5 comic stores in every town. Some towns had 3, some towns had 1. My local store, World of Fantasy, was a great shop. It was on Deer Park Avenue in Deer Park. Tom, I don't remember his last name, owned it. That's where I cut my teeth in reading and collecting with my closest friend Seth, and I took to Todd McFarlane's work immediately, and you'll see a lot of Todd on this channel. If you ever see the phrase "see Todd, buy Todd," that came from this mouth, first episode. When you see Todd, you buy Todd. Remember, kids. Over the years, I would just buy Wolverine and Spidey and Batman and collect the artists I love: McFarlane, Larson, Liefeld, the 90s guys, Stephen Platt, Joe Madureira. After World of Fantasy closed, my new store was Collector's Kingdom, which is another store that I had always been familiar with and always been friendly with the owner, Mike Bradley, and that store is responsible for meeting one of my other closest friends. We were fortunate enough in New York to have local stores everywhere and different stores. It was just a lot of fun to collect comics and read comics on Long Island and be a comics fan. And I think a lot of that has to do with, Marvel and DC being based out of New York. But I had always just collected, and as I got older and graduated high school, I kind of stopped reading. But that's pretty much everybody in the 90s who was turning 17, 18, 19 towards the end of the 90s, they stopped reading. I perceived comics to not be as good, but I was just not reading the right stuff. It wasn't until years later that my friend Larry had given me a couple of books to read that I had never read before, and they were Sin City, they were Sandman, Preacher. So it was the work of Ennis, it was the work of Gaiman, it was the work of Alan Moore, it was Frank Miller. It was the stuff that I just did not have the exposure to because nobody was saying you need to read this. It was just buy your monthly superhero books. And I think that's one of the reasons why this channel also exists, because I've read a lot. I've read a lot of full runs and full stories. I feel like the only way for people to know what to read is by either buying everything or word of mouth. And word of mouth is one of my favorite ways to experience things: movies, music, and comics, and books in general. Because there are people in your life that you end up trusting that when they tell you, like, you might like this, you give it a try. In my early 20s, I started to go and experience all the Vertigo and the non-superhero books. And I definitely shied away from superhero books for almost a decade. And in the early 2000s, when I was really back into comics full-time, I was reading things like Saga, Why the Last Man, and Fables, and Lock and Key, and Walking Dead. Walking Dead was huge for me because there was a huge buzz around how good it was. And fuck, that is a great book, but it is very, very emotionally draining. It is very much part of that wave of storytelling that has come over us in the last 20 years of being really invested in characters and then having them ripped away from you. Game of Thrones, Walking Dead, Lost, like all of these different character-based stories, whether they're in shows or movies or books, and you have your heart ripped out of your chest when they get killed. My love of superhero books never died down. I was just not finding something that was good enough. And along came Invincible, and Invincible rocked my world. And I thank Seth, my buddy, for telling me to read that, because it is one of the greatest books. And I'm now revisiting it and reading it again. One of the local stores that I loved, that I became friends with, was Grasshopper Comics in Mineola, New York. And I had worked there a couple of weekends. The owner, John Riley, was a really nice guy, and I was a young kid that he just paid me in comics to work there. And in my professional career, I'd worked with a couple of different organizations. I'd worked with the Hero Initiative on a charity event. I worked with Ace Comic Con for a couple of years doing a charity auction with them. And I had a brief stint with the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, which I have nothing positive to say about that. So I've been in and out of comics. I've been reading comics. I've been selling comics. I had an Etsy shop for years where I would just throw up random vintage comics and people would buy them, and I've had my eBay store for years. The selling part of it has always been part of my repertoire, let's say. When COVID hit and I started watching some of these live sales, and I'm like, well, all right, I can do this. You know, I know how to speak into a camera. I know how to welcome people. I know how to be funny. You know, all those things that keep people engaged. Plus, now I've got this huge influx of comics because I started buying collections from people. Creating a community for people to buy, for people to talk about comics, is what I've always wanted for myself. I'm just trying to create a place that people can come and enjoy themselves, talk about comics, feel free to say what they want. You can say you didn't enjoy it. You can talk about how much you love it. I will never put somebody else's love down. I might have a different opinion, but you're not going to ever come to this community and feel like, oh, this person just shot down what I love. No, I will never do that. I might say, that's not my thing, which is fine. Like Clayton Crane. I don't like his art. Oh, well. It has been the most rewarding experience of my life. I can't speak highly enough to the response that I've gotten from everybody. Just wanted to give a little overview, a little history of where I'm coming from, and give you a little insight into, well, you don't want to be in there. So every Wednesday, if you can find me here selling, or every once in a while I'll jump back on Instagram and do a sale on there and maybe whatnot. You can find the links to my eBay store below, but honestly, if you're buying something from me off eBay, if you hit me up on Instagram, I'm going to give it to you cheaper because there are no fees there. If you want to buy in a system, that's fine. I understand. I'll drop a new video every Sunday morning. You can look forward to the live show on Sunday night, which is Sunday Sit Down. And that show is basically going to be a smorgasbord. Once a month, we'll do book club. I'm going to have interviews with industry professionals, and I'm going to have interviews with other sellers because that's part of this community. Let's talk about why we're selling what we're doing. And then I appreciate you for sticking around for this episode. If you're watching for the first time, hit the subscribe button. If you are already subscribed, hit the like button. And if you want to drop a comment below, another question, something that I didn't answer about the origins of what I do and why I do, please do. I'll respond. I got nothing better to do but talk to you. All right. Well, this has been a great episode. I'm going to go. I have really bad gas. Yeah.